Rome knew its seasons well, spring for festivals, summer for wars, and autumn for harvesting. But that winter was unlike any other, a harsh cold that crept from the north, closing the roads, freezing the rivers, and keeping the armies in their tents waiting for warmth. In the markets, bread became more precious than gold, and in the palaces, the torches went out one after another. It was as if the city that ruled the world was beginning to lose its heat bit by bit. That was the long winter, the winter in which the empire grew cold. Night was falling over Rome slowly this time, not as usual when the curtain closes on a day crowded with sounds, chariots, and merchants, but like a heavy shadow crawling over walls that knew the warmth would not return soon. The few fires burning in the squares flickered under a cold wind coming from the north, and people huddled around them, stretching out their trembling hands while their eyes followed the flying sparks as if they were the last stars of winter. The city that was once the center of the world began to feel its heart pulse slowing down. The streets that once buzzed with the whistles of the guards and the neighing of horses were now silent. In the markets, merchants hid what remained of their grain under covers, and in the houses, old fireplaces were lit, asking for wood but finding none. Even the voice of the Tiber, the river of life, became faint, flowing like a sick man's bed that no one heard anymore. Famine was peeking its head from dark corners, and the cold seeped through the cracks into our chests. No one talked about glory or the empire anymore, but about a warm day and a loaf of bread shared between neighbors. In a distant palace on the hill, a scribe wrote by the dim light of a candle, "Even great Rome fears the winter." This sentence alone summarized an entire era, an era in which warmth began to leave the empire as birds leave their nests with the first storm. The sky was overcast, and the moon slipped between the clouds to illuminate the statues of the emperors that had lost their luster. They seemed to look in confusion at a city that no longer recognized itself. Rome, which built the world with stone, sat tonight shivering on its stones. That was just the first chapter, a sign of the beginning of the long cold, a time that would later be called the last winter of the empire. In the far north of the empire, winter held its breath over a great river called the Rhine. For centuries, this river was the boundary between two worlds, Rome with its order, army, and laws, and behind it the peoples of the forests and snows, the Vandals and others whom the Romans called barbarians. On one of the evenings at the end of the year, on the 31st of December, 406 AD, the cold descended on the river until some imagined it had fallen asleep under a blanket of ice. Some Roman writers narrated that the waters froze, and entire tribes crossed over it, men, women, children, and livestock. But others said they found abandoned crossings and that the guards had withdrawn after being exhausted by months of hunger and cold. Whatever the truth, that night was a turning point. Entire hordes left their lands behind the Rhine, seeking warmth and food in the heart of the empire itself. In the morning, the river was no longer a border, but became a bridge to chaos. Gaul, including what is now known as France and Belgium, woke up to sounds it had never heard before: walls collapsing, roads filling with fleeing chariots, and monasteries hiding grain stores from hungry eyes. In Mainz, one of the first cities located on the banks of the Rhine, it was said that fires broke out in the markets and bells rang without stopping until dawn. In distant Rome, the news arrived weeks later, but its echo was colder than snow. A gate from the gates of the north had fallen, and no one could guarantee when it would close again. Emperor Honorius was then in Ravenna, a fortified city between the marshes and the sea, looking at a map that had lost half its colors. The roads that used to send grain and soldiers from the north were now at the mercy of its moving tribes. The winter that froze the river simultaneously melted the last confidence in the empire's borders. Since that night, the world created by the Romans began to crack silently, just as a sheet of ice cracks under the feet of travelers. Rome was still enjoying its light in the south, but the cold that began at the Rhine was moving toward it with certain slowness. For centuries, Rome knew that its strength did not come from swords alone, but from the bread that fed millions of people every day. In a state spanning 3 continents, bread was a sacred political and economic act, governed by a precise system the Romans called cura annani, meaning the care of the city's provisions. Roman Africa, in what is today Tunisia and eastern Algeria, was the great wheat basket of the empire. Ships would depart from the ports of Carthage and Sfax, carrying thousands of tons of grain, reaching the port of Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber River, then being transporting in small boats to the heart of Rome itself. Every year, millions of loaves were distributed for free to the people as part of the bread and circuses, panem et circenses policy that maintained the calm of the masses and the security of the capital. Even Sicily, the fertile island south of Italy, supplied Rome with wheat, oil, and wine, while specialized officials oversaw every shipment entering the port, recording them accurately on wooden tablets as if they were the heartbeats of the empire. But the winds began to change. In the year 439 AD, the Vandals seized Carthage, the most important African port and the greatest reservoir of wheat. From that moment, a vital artery was cut from the body of Rome. Ships no longer arrived as they used to, and relying on Sicily alone was not enough. Markets were filled with anxiety, prices rose, and the bread that was distributed for free was sold for many times its price. In some years, provisions did not even last until spring, and people waited for the boats as they waited for rain. The problem was not just in the wheat, but in everything related to it. The mills that stopped when shipments decreased, the bakers who disappeared looking for work in other cities, and the officials who wrote long reports about the lack of supply, but no one could change the sea or recover the Africa that was lost. In Portus, the new harbor built in the 1st century AD to expand trade, the anchored ships made a light groaning sound under the wind, as if they knew their journeys would never be the same. The river that had carried grain day after day began to witness the return of boats empty or loaded with bad news. Thus, hunger began to crawl into the capital, not as a sudden storm, but as a long shadow creeping slowly. The loss of Africa was not just a loss of land, but a loss of warmth and the daily rhythm of life. The great empire was discovering something it had never known before, that hunger can defeat swords, and that bread, not iron, is what keeps cities alive. But bread needs a clear sky and a calm sea. Not every cold in Rome's history was the result of winds or wars. In the mid-6th century AD, something happened that changed the features of the sky itself. In the year 536 AD, a Byzantine historian named Procopius wrote, "The sun did not shine as it used to, but sent a pale light like the moon, and people saw the day as if it were a never-ending sunset." What people did not know then was that the world was passing through a rare and destructive natural event. Great volcanoes erupted somewhere on Earth, perhaps in the northern part of the Eastern Hemisphere or in Central America, sending thick ash into the atmosphere. That ash spread like a gray curtain, blocking the sun's light, so the Earth cooled suddenly, crops failed, and long years of climate mystery began. Scientists today call it the beginning of the late antique Little Ice Age, a period that lasted nearly a century, starting in 536. Volcanic eruptions followed in 540 and perhaps 547, increasing the atmosphere's darkness and cold. Those years did not leave their mark only in the papers of historians, but in the trunks of trees and in the layers of ice in Greenland, where scientists today can read the traces of sulfur and ash as if reading a page from a book sleeping in the snow. In Europe and the East, drought hit the fields, spring was delayed, and fruits began to fall before they ripened. In small Italian villages, farmers raised their eyes toward a gray sky that did not shine and said the sun was sick. In Constantinople, the eastern capital of the empire, people spoke of a strange, cold light and a sea whose water turned dark as lead. Temperatures dropped, rivers froze in regions that had never known ice, and snow accumulated in the fields until animals perished and the herds that fed the cities died out. This winter was not like any other. It was a herald of a new stage, a long stage of cold and shadows that affected empires and kingdoms, where agricultural life, trade, and roads shrank. The road from the farm to the market became a journey through mud and snow, and bread became rare even in seasons that were once abundant. Thus nature intertwined with history, and it was no longer clear which was stronger, the anger of the earth or the weakness of man. Under this pale shroud of light, Rome and the world around it were entering a new winter, a winter longer than seasons and deeper than cold. But if summer grows cold, how can autumn stay warm? In ancient times, wars were not fought year-round as they are today. Armies had their seasons just as farmers had theirs. If winter came, the swords went silent, tents were folded, and the dust raised by wheels stopped. In Rome, leaders knew that the cold was an enemy that could not be defeated. The Roman roads, famous for their discipline and precision, turned into paths of mud in the rain, where wheels sank to their axles and soldiers stumbled in the mire. Provisions were the biggest problem. Food could not withstand long journeys in the cold and humidity, and the cattle used for pulling grew weak and died quickly in storms. Even fire, that constant companion of soldiers, refused to light in wet tents. In those harsh seasons, armies would distribute into what was called wintering, meaning returning to barracks or fortified cities to spend the winter there. They repaired weapons, treated the wounded, and recalculated supplies and equipment in preparation for the coming spring. The Roman military writer Vegetius said in his work, "War needs time and patience, and whoever wants victory in summer must prepare for it in winter." Therefore, the winter of silence was a season for planning, not for fighting. But that silence was not peace. The calm hid behind it exhaustion, hunger, and fear of tomorrow. Every leader knew his army might weaken if the cold lasted, and a losing battle might start before a single arrow was fired due to lack of food, the collapse of bridges, or frozen rivers. Even military messages were delayed. Messengers were unable to cross snow-covered mountains, and convoys were trapped in passes until the ice melted. Frontier cities like Dara in the east or Arles in the west relied on huge silos filled in autumn to ensure survival until spring when the earth thawed again. Over the centuries, stopping the fight in winter became part of the traditions of European armies and a symbol of boundaries imposed by nature, not by laws. As for the last winter of Rome, those closed roads and stagnant armies were a true image of a frozen world waiting for warmth to rearrange its history. Winter was descending on Rome, this time not as a passing season, but as a silent enemy wrapping itself around its walls. Outside, the Goth armies under King Vitiges surrounded the city from every side, and inside stood the Byzantine commander Belisarius, trying to keep the old capital alive. This happened in the years 537 and 538 AD, when the Gothic War broke out between the Byzantine Empire in the east and the Goth kingdom in Italy. Rome was, as in many of its critical times, more of a symbol than a functioning city, but even symbols need water and bread to survive. The first thing the Goths did was cut the aqueducts, those arteries that had supplied the city with water for centuries. Water was cut off from houses, baths, and gardens, and the fountains that used to sing in the squares dried up. Even the soldiers on the walls began to drink from salty wells or rainwater. Then hunger began, for the wheat warehouses were almost empty, and the provisions that arrived from the east were few and threatened. Belisarius had only one solution: to use the Tiber itself to grind the wheat. Then the army engineers came up with a clever idea. They set up floating mills on the river, moved by the push of the water, with the millstones turning atop boats. It was a strange sight, the mills turning with a faint sound amidst the cold, while on the two banks, the fighting flared and the shouts of guards were heard. As the weeks passed, bread was distributed by weight and count, and bakeries opened for limited hours only. At night, doors were closed for fear of theft, and people lit their homes with small bits of oil, trying to warm their souls more than their hands. The cold was not the only danger, but fear as well, fear that the wall would collapse, that the grain would run out, or that the corpses would overflow inside the city after burial stopped. The siege lasted about a year. The people and soldiers fought hunger and isolation together until the Goths finally withdrew, leaving behind a city changed forever. Rome lost thousands of its inhabitants, and many of its neighborhoods became empty like wet ruins. Although Belisarius won militarily, Rome itself did not triumph over its winter. In that year, the fire in the hearth was not enough, the prayers in the churches were not enough, and the old glory was not able to return the warmth to the stone. The siege was more than a battle, it was a lesson in the fragility of civilization before the cold of nature. Between a message and a soldier's plea, we hear the creak of empty warehouses. After the battles fell silent and the armies retreated, fear did not leave the hearts of people, it only changed its form. Daily fear now was hunger. In Rome and Gothic Italy, authority was trying to restore order to what remained of life. There was no longer an army fighting, but men writing long letters in cold offices, trying to organize the distribution of grain, taxes, and provisions. Among those distant voices, the name Cassiodorus stands out, a cultured man and a minister to the Goth kings. He wrote many letters later collected in a book he called Veri, and in them we hear the echo of that exhausting time. In one of his letters, he asks a local governor to send the grain ships on time, saying in a calm tone, "The people do not live on promises, but on bread." In another letter, he reminds officials that hunger does not distinguish between rich and poor, and that delaying one shipment of grain might set an entire city on fire. These letters were written in official language, but between the lines, fatigue and plea appear. The officials who signed the orders were themselves suffering from a lack of food, and the villages asked to send grain no longer had enough for their own people. In those years, famine became an administrative system. Everything was measured in grain: how many ships sailed, how many silos were filled, how many loaves were distributed a day. Even laws revolved around grain. Whoever smuggled wheat was punished, whoever reduced the weight of a loaf was lashed, and whoever hid his stock was pursued like a criminal. But behind these rigid texts was real life: mothers dividing the last crust among their children, farmers trying to plow a dry land that does not rain, and guards exchanging grain secretly at night. Cassiodorus himself, who lived among kings and books, saw in every administrative order a call for help. Perhaps he knew that the words he wrote would not stop hunger, but at least they would preserve its memory. Thus language turned into a mirror of famine, and letters into an image of survival. The empire that used to issue its orders in prosperity was now writing them on wet papers sent via deserted roads, arriving late just as rain arrives after the crops are gone. In that era, famine was not just a crisis, but it became a new way of life, a language spoken by everyone: kings, writers, soldiers, and women in empty kitchens. Then the disease came from the silence of the ports. People thought that the cold was the maximum they could bear, but in the year 541 AD, an invisible enemy arrived at the shores of the Mediterranean that would change the face of history forever. It came from the south, from the ports of ancient Egypt, with the ships carrying wheat and goods toward Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Empire. The city was crowded and the markets buzzed with people, and when the first ships arrived, no one noticed that death was among the cargo. In the beginning, strange cases appeared: men falling suddenly in the streets, a fever burning at night, and black swellings on the body. Then the count began to climb with unbelievable speed. In a few days, the great city turned into a dense silence, broken only by the sound of coffins. This is the Justinian plague, later named after Emperor Justinian I because he was infected with it himself. The epidemic spread from Constantinople to Asia Minor, then to Greece, Italy, and North Africa, and from there to the rest of Europe. Corpses were collected in huge carts and buried in trenches until there was no longer enough space. In the villages, the dead were left in their homes because people feared approaching. Trade was cut off, ships stopped in the ports, and no one dared to transport goods for fear of infection. One historian says that the dead in Constantinople reached 10,000 in some days, and it is said that the city was emptied of half its inhabitants within weeks. In the West, news arrived late, but it was enough to sow terror. In Rome, which was barely recovering from its long siege, the disease began to spread among soldiers and merchants, and churches turned into shelters for the sick. In the countryside, farming stopped again, as farmers perished before they could sow or harvest. The plague did not distinguish between rich and poor, nor between a priest or a warrior, and in every house, someone would leave in the morning and not return. People thought the end of the world was near, and that the cold that hung over the sky came to close the last door on the era of the empire. It is said that the epidemic continued in intermittent waves for about an entire century, returning and then fading as if it were a shadow that does not leave the earth. Between each wave and the next, cities weakened more, fields became barren, and roads were emptied of travelers. The plague was a new voice in the long winter of Rome, a voice that was not heard, but its trace was never erased. After it, the empire was no longer the same, nor did people trust the spring that comes after the cold. The sea became another opponent, and winter a hand that put out the ovens. The sea, in the eyes of the Romans, was the path to salvation. From it came ships with wheat, oil, and wine, and through it, Rome linked the ends of its vast empire. But the sea itself in the time of winter turned into a mysterious opponent that could not be trusted. When the winds intensified in the months of December, January, and February, ports closed their doors and ships were pulled to the land for fear of storms. In that time, there was no precise compass or maps to guide sailors when the moon disappeared behind the clouds. A single trip from Sicily to the port of Ostia might take weeks instead of days, and it is said that some ships that sailed in autumn did not arrive until early spring after the currents drifted them to distant shores. With the stoppage of sailing, warehouses in the capital began to run out gradually. Wheat stored in summer was only enough for a few months, and every delay in shipping meant longer queues and higher prices. At the end of winter, people called that period the time of bitter bread because flour was mixed with whatever was available, barley, lentils, or even sawdust. As for the coastal villages, they lived on the hope of a single ship's arrival. People went out to the shore every morning looking toward the sea. If they spotted a white sail on the horizon, prayers rose in every house, and if nothing appeared, the city returned to its heavy silence. In some years, ships sank near the port itself. Seen from the walls as they swayed over the waves before being swallowed by the water, along with the provisions thousands had waited for. No one could do anything but watch from afar while the bread in the markets decreased day after day. In Rome, the river that transporting shipments from Ostia to the city partially froze on cold nights, stopping the small boats. When the water melted in the day, they moved slowly under heavy rain, carrying what remained of life on their backs. A slight delay in one shipment was enough to completely change the day of the city. Bakeries closed, rumors spread, and people began to store what flour they had left. When bread appeared the next morning, everyone crowded around it as if it were gold. Thus, the sea was friend and enemy at the same time. When its waters were calm, it gave life, and when they raged, it put out the ovens and cut off the livelihoods of millions. Over time, people feared winter not for its cold alone, but because it meant hunger coming from the sea. The wheat's path from the shore to the table was longer and harsher than the path of wars. Every time a ship was delayed, Rome felt the cold had moved closer. The city of a million was putting out its lamps one by one. Rome was once the largest city on earth. In the 1st century AD, it buzzed with nearly 1 million people, lit at night by torches, with the sounds of water flowing in aqueducts, the clinking of dishes in markets, and the noise of chariots in the wide squares echoing in its neighborhoods. But those sounds began to disappear one by one, as candles are put out in a large hall one after another. After centuries of glory, blows came one after another: looting, famine, siege, and plague. Rome did not die with a single blow. It melted slowly as snow melts in a weak sun. By the mid-6th century AD, whoever walked in its streets saw more bones than people. The aqueducts had been cut long ago, turning public baths into abandoned halls filled with spiders. The theaters that used to ring with songs became shelters for birds, and the bakeries that worked day and night grew cold until they became piles of ash. No one cared about repairing what was destroyed. The workforce had died from the plague, and the money was looted or evaporated in wars. Even the temples of the old gods were closed, and some were converted into small churches inhabited by silence. It is said that the population of Rome in that time did not exceed 30,000 only, most of them living around the banks of the Tiber, where water was closer and bread slightly easier. No one wandered in the northern neighborhoods anymore. They were covered by grass and wild plants until it was said that wolves were seen at night on the outskirts of the city. But the wonder is that life did not stop completely. Amidst the ruins, churches kept ringing their bells, and some small workshops kept making tools, as if the city were resisting death with a slow breath. Its inhabitants planted gardens inside the walls, collected rain in old basins, and lived on what was available from small trade or simple exchange between neighbors. The shape of Rome changed. It was no longer the city of the empire, but a large village over glorious ruins. What was once the heart of the world became a faint echo resounding in minds more than heard in streets. At that moment in history, Rome was no longer a name for a place, but a memory of a past era. With every new winter, it put out another of its old lamps. The Roman soldier did not fear war, he feared winter. In fields far from the cities, camps were built of mud and wood, and trenches were dug around them to repel rain and freezing water. Chariots were stacked, warehouses were tightly closed, and soldiers sat around small fires waiting for dawn as a traveler waits for a ship. In those months, the earth turned into a sea of mud. Chariots sank, horses stumbled, and the old roads that the Romans paved with stones became rivers of slime where it was impossible to walk, fight, or transport provisions from cities to the fronts. War in those days froze as water freezes. Armies did not advance, and messengers were delayed. Even letters sent from the emperor to the front commanders arrived after weeks or did not arrive at all. In the east, on the borders of the Persians, fortresses like Dara and Nisibis kept huge stores of barley and wheat, but the road to them was fraught with rain and cold. Soldiers on the front lines waited for support as the thirsty wait for rain. Sometimes provisions arrived late, so soldiers divided dry bread or a handful of barley for the horses. The nights were long and cold, in which the soldier heard the creaking of the wind on the tents and the sound of iron contracting from the cold. In the cities, the governor wrote to the capital, "The roads are closed, and the soldiers are in their positions, not moving." There was no rebellion or defeat, but a long wait without an end. Even great commanders like Belisarius in his wars against the Goths suspended their campaigns every winter, writing in their letters that spring alone is what opens the roads and returns life to wheels, fodder, and weapons. Roman armies realized that war is not in the battle alone, but in the ability to withstand when nothing happens, to keep your fire burning, to keep the horses standing, to count the provisions, to wait for the day when light shines again. In those cold seasons, time passed with a heavy slowness. Every morning looked like the one before it, until waiting became part of the soldier's life, and spring became for him more than a season. It was a promise of return to movement, to warmth, to hope. The empire learned that the sword does not cut in the cold, and that armies, however great, cannot conquer winter. The winter of Rome was not a single season, but a long time that spanned centuries of cold, cold in the weather, in hearts, and in cities that went silent bit by bit. Since that distant night, the night of crossing the Rhine River in 406 AD, cracks began to appear in the body of the empire. With every decade that passed, a piece of warmth left the Roman world. Rome lost its wheat from Africa, lost its trade with the sea, and lost the people who used to populate its streets. Then came the great cold in the mid-6th century to close the sky with thick grey shadows, making the sun itself look pale as if it were breathing with difficulty. Under this cold, fields withered, roads dried up, and armies slept in muddy camps waiting for spring. Spring did not come as it used to, but became shorter and colder. Time itself had changed. In the heart of this scene, Rome, the one from which the sun of the empire rose, sat silently among its ruins. The walls were still standing, but behind them there was no longer the bustle of life. The city became like an old man, remembering the days of his glory and smiling silently over ruins no one else saw as he did. Every new year. People said the cold would vanish, but the cold remained as if it chose to live with the empire until its end. The last winter was more than just weather. It was a major historical moment when cold, hunger, plague, and war met at once, and nature and man closed the door on an entire era. With the fall of warmth came the birth of a new world. In the place of that ancient empire, new peoples began slowly building what would become medieval Europe. But the warmth of old Rome was no longer that flame that lit the world. It was extinguished by thick ash from winter and oblivion. Thus, the story ended. The empire did not break on a specific day, but melted like ice with a slowness no one heard until it became a memory. With the last lamp extinguished in its night, a new dawn began, the dawn of another world that left behind the ash of a cold empire and the heat of a lesson not forgotten. Thus, the winter lasted until it seemed like the image of an entire era.